So we said a safe, stable attachment is vital, and without that, children focus on surviving rather than developing, growing, and developing all those normal skills for life. And so when we're talking about complex trauma, and let me see if I've got the right side.
Sorry, can you leave the left of the ground?
Yeah, it's okay, I had the wrong slide anyway.
Send these out.
Yeah, absolutely.
We will send the slides out
Yeah.
after the forum.
So complex trauma, we're talking about ongoing trauma exposure and the developmental impact of that exposure. Are you right with that now, or shall I?
Yes, all right.
Yeah. I'm going to talk a little bit about coping strategies. So a child who's being repeatedly abused and betrayed will cope as best they can. And often there is no thinking adult for that child to go to share their experiences, to have their experiences validated. So some of the coping strategies adopted in childhood are not all that constructive for later life, but they need to be understood in the context of trauma, because in the context of trauma, it's the best the child can do. And some of those coping strategies become risk factors for later adult disease, both physical and mental health disease. So smoking, alcohol, high-risk sexual behaviours, physical inactivity, overeating. And there's been a very large ongoing study in the States of over 17,000 people who've experienced multiple forms of childhood trauma, which has shown the potential physical health impacts of these coping strategies. And obviously, suicidality, self-harm, tendency to get back into abusive relationships, to repeat patterns that it's familiar. People who will marry 3 alcoholic husbands in a row. It's magnetic. It's a fit. If you don't know anything else, that's comfortable for you. So it's very important when we talk about trauma-informed care for workers, health professionals, to understand these coping strategies instead of judging them. Obviously, they can present as very challenging behaviours, and obviously for a consumer, who's cutting? That's the only way often to feel some sense of control. But it's a tough way to live. But if they're understood as adaptive behaviours, then consumers will feel a lot less shame and a lot less self-blame, and be able to work through them better with support. So, challenges. It is hard for health professionals to know how to support consumers who experience childhood abuse. It's much harder for the consumer, of course. Because there are the challenges not just from the trauma, but then the flow-on effects to people's lives. The lack of social supports, families that are exploded. I don't talk to my mother and brother, and that's quite common. I was lucky I got an education, and somehow that education protected me in a way, because when I was a doctor it gave me an identity that I didn't have elsewhere. A lot of people, can't complete their education, and they, find it really hard to maintain a job. We talked about some of these issues before, the difficulties forming relationships and trusting and maintaining relationships. Being very hypersensitive to criticism, because it's like you become allergic. Any suggestion of someone saying negative, and you can be quite reactive, and I've certainly been responsible for doing that, and probably still am. So these are other forms of other causes of complex trauma. So trauma, any sort of violence in the community, war trauma, refugees, suffer the most incredible compounded traumas. Not only are they dislocated from their homes and families, but they come to alien environments such as Australia, and then suffer repeated traumas and victimisations. And obviously, again, these are compounded by the repercussions of struggling in a daily life with homelessness, poverty, other issues there. So current services. I think our mental health system has a very poor record in trauma, as do other service systems, because basically the critical factor that trauma underpins so many consumers' issues, not just in mental health, but social welfare issues, physical health, has not filtered through, so it doesn't inform responses. And so you have a very compartmentalised response. And what we need to see is much more coordination, integration between responses to mental health, substance abuse, because often a lived experience of trauma is what underpins the whole set. But we need to get that message across to the policymakers, and it's a slow conversation. Now I've been trained in the medical model, symptoms, signs, differential diagnoses, pathology and treatment. Trauma doesn't fit that model, and what we need to do is convince medicos to move away from a medical model, which is going to be challenging, I can tell you, to a trauma injury model. So instead of saying, this is the pathology, this is your diagnosis, something's wrong with you, what happened to you? What's the cause, what's the basis of what's going on, of all those presentations. So, I mean, as I said before, I talked about the lack of understanding around complex trauma. There's this diagnosis of PTSD, which is valid. Obviously, people, a lot of people who've experienced trauma experience PTSD, but complex trauma, you experience a lot of other different presentations and challenges. And, at one point, I don't know how many diagnoses I carried. And I suppose that's a key issue. A lot of people who've experienced trauma have a list of diagnoses, the length of your arm, and what shows you how well that system's working, doesn't it? So we need to find some other way of understanding trauma, and it's about understanding the basis of it and the causality. So yes, the substantive cause issue of what happened to you to affect you so profoundly needs to inform practitioners, services, responses. At the moment it's just interest value only, just something that's curious. And that makes little sense given the recognition and integration of experienced trauma, of what your past lived experience was, and understanding the impacts of the past on your current behaviours and reactions is really crucial to the recovery process. We also need to understand that recovery from complex trauma can take a long time and go through a number of phases. But I suppose there's a lot of different modalities out there, and there's a lot of competition between practitioners about whose is best. But I think what we've found is that forming relationships is probably absolutely core. Rebuilding that trust, knowing that someone is there to hear and listen and feeling safe, is probably, the lion's share of what needs to happen. Many trauma survivors haven't connected what's happened to them and what's going on in the present. But then nor have their health workers and the people supporting them. And certainly ASCA's experience is that callers to our 1300 line tell us stories that make our hair curl of GPs who didn't ask about trauma even though it's really apparent, of psychiatry, and I'm not trying to single out any discipline here. It's a response of individuals that minimise, dismiss, label, say it was the classic is such a long time ago, not affecting you now, get over it, get on with it, and I mean that still goes on to quite a great degree, or in fact blaming a person, it was their fault, and certainly many survivors do blame themselves because that's what you've been told as a child. You feel bad, you feel worthless, and that inappropriate shame and self-blame does continue. And certainly in my own process, it took me many, many years before I could actually forgive the child. That how could I expect a 6-year-old who didn't have the words for what was happening to do something different and to stop it happening? But it was very hard for me to let go of that blame and shame. And it's very important, therefore, for us to continue to educate and inform community members, definitely, but health professionals and health workers, absolutely. So ASCA's a small organisation, and we do deliver some trauma-specific services to mental health consumers, many of who don't have or can't find another place to turn, and often that's because of negative experiences in the past. And it takes a lot of courage, as I'm sure many of you know, to come forward and say that you were abused, to disclose. And when that's not handled appropriately, you're much less inclined to do it again for a while, and that can really delay people's ability to get the help that they need. So we're certainly advocating a trauma-informed approach to care and practice, so moving away from the search for a diagnosis to recognition of a person's life experience, lived experience of their trauma. Because it's often the lived experience which leads to the contact with whatever the service is, the alcohol and drug service, the mental health service. And it's the lived experience which precipitates those difficult coping strategies adopted as a way to manage traumatic stress. Trauma-informed care, certainly within mental health services, but we're advocating it for all human allied services right across the board. And it needs to be supported with trauma-specific services, so direct services that respond to people's direct experience in a holistic approach to care. Instead of seeing people in fragments, which is really quite ironic, because when you experience trauma, you're in fragments, and our mental health system is in fragments, and also works in a very compartmentalised, siloed way, which is certainly when my memories of my trauma were very compartmentalised. I dissociated them, and I had no connections between them, and that's our system of care. So trauma-informed. How are we going for time? Because I managed to lose my watch.
No, you're fine. I'm talking.
Yeah. So it's a strength-based framework. So focuses on a person's internal strength, and just the sheer effort of surviving shows that people are strong and people are resilient. Empowers people and builds on that, and it's grounded in an understanding and responsiveness to the impact of trauma in people's lives. Emphasises physical, psychological and emotional safety for both providers and survivors, because obviously it can be challenging supporting people who've experienced trauma, listening to trauma stories, and the risk of vicarious traumatisation in workers, and services needs to be addressed as well. But obviously also is aware of potential triggers and vulnerabilities so that people are not re-traumatised in services.